My name is Mark Dawson. I'm 55 years old and retired. I left early because I worked hard when I was young and became successful. All bonuses and stock options went into my retirement account for many years. When my colleagues bought BMWs or Mercedes, I stayed true to my Mustangs. While they moved into their country mansions, I stayed in my modest home in the suburbs. The result of this frugality is that my wife and I have more than enough money to continue spoiling our college-bound son and living the life we've always dreamed of. We have a few vacations planned for the coming months while I get used to life in retirement. But first, Mark Jr. needs to get used to college, while he comes home every weekend. We don't mind, but it will take time to break the chains. Do you think I'll say, cut the umbilical cord? No, my son and I are very close. He is the spitting image of me, and yes, he was home that fateful day when my life changed. 4 damn words changed my life. As strange as it may sound, 4 words erased all those years of hard work. I used to be 5 foot 10 inches tall, and I had masculine, attractive features. My hair used to be medium brown. I think some of it is still brown, but there's a lot of gray there already. My eyes are still blue, and I can still attract the eyes of several women if I want. But I haven't wanted this for almost 30 years. You see, I fell in love in my early 20s and haven't looked back since. For most of my life, only one woman owned my heart, and she sleeps right next to me, just like it should be. Miriam, my wife, is as beautiful today as the day we met. Okay, she has a little more wrinkles on her face now, but I see her as she was. Miri was built like a brick factory then and remains so today. The bricks may have moved a little, but they're still there. I woke up that fateful day thinking I was still dreaming. I dreamed that I was in paradise, but it was not at all the same paradise that I saw in the church. We made love. Miri, I was in heaven, I sighed. Mark, there is something you need to know, she said seriously. Oh no, not those words, I said. What words, stupid? She asked. I think you're going to say those same words again, I said. Like the ones you said 20 years ago. We will become parents. We're too old for this, she replied and kissed me. Besides, carrying our son took a huge toll on my body. If I gave birth again, no matter how much I want to give you another child, it would kill me. Okay, no kids, I said. It means we're just doing it for fun now. I love you, Miri, I said quietly. What are you doing there? My son Mark suddenly shouted from the other side of the door. I was sleeping, and this woman attacked me. Mark Jr., go back to your room and don't come out until the morning or until I say so, Miri shouted. Mom, it worked when I was 4, Mark said. But firstly, it's already morning, and secondly, I'm already old enough. Besides, aren't you too old for what I think you're doing now? Okay, she said, smiling at me. Go to your room, or I won't make you your damn raspberry pancakes, and I won't let your dad do that stupid thing you and him planned before the barbecue. Oh shit, Mark Jr. said. I'm going to my room, Mom. When will the pancakes be ready? I don't care about him, she said, smiling. Let's get back to what we were doing. Honey, what did you want to tell me? I asked. Oh, right, she said. You probably already know that. But lately I've been thinking a lot. Maybe I'm just getting old, but damn, so are you. Anyway, I reflected on my life, and it was perfect. What I mean is that if I had to live my life over again and choose the person to spend it with, it would be you. I love you, Mark, with all my heart and soul. I belong to you. I know that, Miri, I said. I always knew it. No, honey, you don't understand, she said seriously. People say this all the time. We know people who have been together longer than us, but live together only for the sake of the children, and they say this too. We know people who can't stand each other, but they say it too. Everyone says these words, Mark, but very few actually mean them, and I just want you to know that I mean it. Well, thank you, Miri. Now about the pancakes. You said raspberry ones, right? I asked. Aren't you going to say anything in response, mister? She asked. What syrup do raspberry pancakes come with? I asked. She bit her lip. Miri, I didn't say this because there was no need. When we were together a few minutes ago, we were truly one. That's why people make love, Miri. This feeling of closeness and unity is what it's all about. If you don't, it's just sex, and it doesn't matter who you do it with. This is exactly how I feel, she said. You understand everything. Tears flowed down her cheeks, and I again thought about the fact that women are sometimes strange. Mark, I've never made love to anyone but you, she said. Yes, yes, I said. So what's with the pancakes? I went to shower while she prepared breakfast. When I went down to the kitchen, my son was already eating. His mother brought a new batch of pancakes to the table, and he reached for them. I swear I saw sparks fly off his knife and fork. Mark, these are for your father, Miri said sharply. You're already on your second helping. Don't they feed you at the university? Why do we pay so much money for food if you are starving? Dad, you'll only eat 3 pancakes anyway, Mark Jr. said. Do you want me to finish the other 3 for you? Didn't you think that maybe your mother would want to eat? Asked Miri. When did you start eating, Mom? Mark Jr. laughed. Isn't that why you're so slim and fit? You usually skip breakfast, right? No, I don't skip breakfast, Miri replied. Then maybe you should get started, Mark said, reaching for some pancakes. After he finished eating, he sat at the table, glaring at me like a puppy waiting to be taken for a walk. Well, son, I said, what's on our program today? When Mark came home, we always did something together for fun. We took turns choosing an activity and always tried to try something new. But just as he was about to say something, there was a knock on the back door. I looked at the door and saw my neighbor and longtime best friend, George Wilson, come into the house. George was the coup of a mid-sized marketing agency for most of his career until he retired 4 years ago. He's 65, 10 years older than me, but still quite active. If Miri and I were delighted with my retirement, then George was no less happy about this event. Being a retiree alone is no fun. He had too much free time and no one to spend it with. He was already making plans for us to go play golf and do other things we enjoyed. Our families have always been very close. The only question was which house or whose lawn we were spending the holidays in. Knock, knock, said George. The neighbors came early. Well, one of them. The bark is still beautiful. Cora was George's wife. She's 48, 7 years younger than me and 17 years younger than George. They never had children. George shocked his family and most of his friends when he married this girl a few days after his 35th birthday. Many believed that she married him only for money. Others believed that he took the child away from the cradle, but they lived together for 30 years, going through a lot. I think their marriage, which has stood the test of time, has refuted all the negative opinions. George was a very successful businessman before his retirement. He was smart and sociable. Cora, on the contrary, was, to put it mildly, not particularly smart, but truly kind. She and Miri were best friends, although they couldn't be more different. Miri is small and compactly built. Her breasts were a little big for her petite frame, but not really big at all. She had a small belly and a few veins in her legs, but what can you do, she was already 54 years old. The bark was much taller and had an impressive shape. She exemplified that God has a sense of humor. She had huge breasts, but a completely flat bottom. It seemed like sitting in a chair must be torture for Cora, because there simply wasn't enough soft tissue on her pelvic bones to cushion the contact with the surface. If it weren't for the crack between her buttocks, no one would have known where her legs ended and her back began. When George sat down at the table, Mark continued talking. Okay, Dad, here's your iPhone. Or do you want mine? He asked. Is there a difference? I answered. No, none, he said, almost bursting with joy. I took my phone. I had an iPhone 4GS, just like him. We both hadn't upgraded to the 5th model yet because we had a year left on our 2-year contract when the iPhone 5 came out. Miri was still using the old iPhone 3G. She didn't care about technological innovations, so her 4-year-old phone suited her just fine. Turn on the GPS app, Mark Jr. said. See these coordinates in the directions folder? he asked. I see, I replied, not understanding what he was up to. I have similar coordinates to another point in the same area. Notice that they are the same distance from us. Damn, I said. What's there? I already guessed that this was another fun ride that Mark had arranged for us. He was obsessed with finding out whose Mustang was faster. Mark Jr. drove a 2004 Mustang. His car was dark blue with racing stripes. He customized almost everything about it. I had a 2010 Mustang. My car was also dark blue, and I admit I also added a few things to it, but only for self-defense. When Mark installed a 3-inch exhaust system on his car, I had to do the same. I gave him a set of brakes for Christmas last year, and of course, to be fair, I had to install the same ones on my car. We were like two superpowers in the Cold War competing, but with love. So, Dad, since you asked, he grinned, there's a little metal box chained under one of the picnic tables where you should be. Inside it lies a cupcake that Mom baked yesterday. You have to arrive there, take a picture of the clock so that you can see what time you got to the point. Then eat half the cupcake and take a photo of it. Then eat the remaining half and take a photo of the empty wrapper. And at the end, a shot of the clock after you eat the cupcake and go home. Whoever has the least time will win. If it's a draw, then I win. Wait a minute, I said. Why do you win if it's a draw? You have an advantage, you eat much faster than me. You're probably just inhaling this cupcake. Yeah, but you have more horsepower, he said. But your car handles better, I objected. Our cars are about equal. But you always win these races, he said. I deserve a little advantage. I want to win a few times before you get old and can't race anymore. I'm a winner, Dad. More like a whiner, I chuckled. Oh, so? He said. Yes, I responded. At this moment, George, who was sitting nearby, intervened in our conversation. Can I? He began. Mark Jr. looked at him as if he had just ruined the holiday. When our eyes turned to George, he smiled nervously. Can I be a part of this? He asked. Mr. Wilson, your BMW is certainly nice, Mark Jr. said. I'm sure you paid a lot of money for it, but this car has neither power nor soul. You won't be able to outrun us. And besides, we only have 2 targets, and you don't have coordinates to either of them. What GPS do you have on your phone? How do you know that my car can't compare with yours? Asked George. 2 years ago, before I had done most of the upgrades on my Mustang, your nephew Carl came to stay with you for the summer. Do you remember this? George nodded. You gave Carl your car so he could go to the movies. He was racing against me and a couple of my friends. Carl had the advantage because I love my car. I would never do anything to hurt her. I wonder who he got it from, Miri shouted from the other room. Anyway, Carl drove your car like he stole it. If you remember, after that you had to change the brakes and do engine repairs. I overtook him, Mr. Wilson. The gap was huge. And now my car is much faster, Mark Jr. said. You should. What if I just go with you or your father? Asked George. Come on, I want to play too. No way, Mark Jr. replied. I still didn't have enough of this for him to scream about injustice because you added extra weight to his car. My dad's car is already heavier than mine, which evens out the difference in horsepower. Then I'll go with you, George suggested. You'll get seasick before we reach our goal, Mark said. I gave driving lessons to Batman. Then he looked at me. Dad, here are your keys, he said. Thank you, son, I replied. I'll have a beer ready for you when you get back. Ha ha, go ahead, he shouted, and we both hurried to run out of the house and jump into our cars. I got into mine a second later than him, but I managed to get going faster. I pulled out of the driveway a split second before he did and ended up in front. We were both driving at 25 miles an hour as we drove through the neighborhood, but as soon as we hit the main road, Mark Jr. pulled to the right, trying to pass me. I pressed the gas pedal, and although the car was already picking up speed, the sudden surge of power caused the rear of my car to skid a little. Mark Jr. overtook me. Ha ha, too many horses for you, old man, he shouted from the window. We took off onto the highway, and I kept up with his bumper. He constantly jerked the steering wheel from side to side, not allowing me to overtake him at the junction. Mark Jr. knew that as soon as we reached the flat sections of the road, I would overtake him. He used the twisty sections to increase his lead. I already understood his plan. He wanted to gain an advantage and hold it in the slow areas of the park while we looked for targets. I had to admit my son could eat like Jethro Bodine, so he'd probably beat me at eating a muffin, especially so soon after breakfast. He'll get back to his car before me and increase his lead. It all depended on whether I could catch him at full speed on the way back down the highway. As soon as we got onto the highway, I ruined his plans. I stepped on the gas again, and my car lurched forward like a scalded cat. A moment later, we were both doing over 100 miles an hour, grinning from ear to ear. A few seconds later, I overtook him and continued to increase the lead. Even without seeing him, I smiled like the Cheshire Cat when I turned onto our exit. I turned right and saw him turn left at the first intersection. I glanced at my phone as I entered the park through the gate. I saw a clock, but no picnic tables. They were about 50 yards from the parking lot. Not seeing anyone nearby, I drove through the parking lot, right on the grass, and drove right up to the picnic tables. Finally, I found the box. I took a photo of the watch as it was running, then took a photo of the cupcake as soon as I opened the box. After tearing the cupcake in half, I took another photo. Then he took a picture of the watch and headed towards the car, which was parked just a few steps away. Okay, I cheated. I didn't eat the damn cupcake. I stuffed half of it into my mouth. I'll finish the second half on the way back. I slowly drove out of the park and continued along the surrounding streets. As soon as I got back on the highway, there was no sign of Mark anywhere. My goal on the way back was to accelerate the car to 150. I should have assumed Mark was ahead of me. If I know him, he cheated with the cupcake too. My speedometer was reading 145 miles per hour and rising. The sound of my pipe bomb exhaust was music to my ears when suddenly the radar detector went off. I saw a group of cars ahead and slowed down, pulling up behind them. Modern radar detectors operate at a greater distance, so I was confident that I would have time to slow down. I sat down behind a Volkswagen Jetta and a minivan. I chuckled, knowing what would happen next. Like clockwork, the driver of the minivan, noticing me, began to speed up. It was so predictable. When a regular guy finds himself behind the wheel of a minivan, he just needs to prove that he's tough. I think it's some kind of defense mechanism against the idea that minivans are for soccer moms. So when he gets behind the wheel of a minivan, he starts acting like he's Mario Andretti to prove to himself that he still has dignity. He drove faster and faster, and soon his minivan began to shake like the Starship Enterprise at 9 cruising speeds. I imagined his kids in the back seat screaming, "Dad, it's falling apart." If this guy doesn't slow down, the strap holding this whole thing together will just break, and he'll have to carry his kids home on his back. But that didn't happen, because as we rounded the bend, one of the 3 police cars hidden their flashes its lights, and the loudspeaker said, "Minivan driver, pull to the side of the road." I almost laughed, but then I noticed Mark Jr. speeding past me in the left lane. He had the passenger window open and gave me the middle finger. "Whoever missed it is late, Dad," he grinned. His laughter suddenly stopped when the lights of another police car came on behind him. The driver demanded through the loudspeaker that Mark stop. I spent the rest of the way home leisurely, enjoying the victory. When I arrived at the house, I slowly got out of the car and burst out laughing. I rushed into the kitchen and took out a beer, not from the refrigerator, but from a box in the pantry. I also grabbed an empty bottle to prank my son. Then I ran out into the backyard and settled into a lounge chair on the deck. Miri and Cora were already there, trying to set the table for our barbecue. "Mark, at least turn on the grill," Miri said. "Mark, why is George angry?" Cora asked. "I came when you and little Mark were leaving in the morning. Now he behaves like those children on the playground who are not allowed to play with the big ones." "I'll tell you later, Cora," I replied. I leaned back and pretended to be asleep when I heard the familiar low roar of Mark June's engine pulling up to the house. I started snoring loudly, and George sat down at one of the tables next to my lounge chair. "What are you?" he began. "Quiet, he's coming," I whispered. Mark Jr. burst into the backyard with a huge smile on his face, holding a folded ticket in his hands. "Where are you, cheater?" he shouted, looking around. Miri returned to the yard with a huge tray containing 5 steaks. "Mark, your father fell asleep. You must have worn him out. Someone needs to turn on the grill if we're going to eat on time." "I'll do it," George suggested. Mark continued to look for me while George spoke to him. "I'm going to do one of your duties, young man. Maybe you should thank me," he said. At that moment, Mark noticed me and came over to kick my lounge chair. "Stop pretending, old man. If you hadn't cheated, I would have won," he said. "Mark, your father doesn't cheat," Miri countered. "He could have at least warned me that the cops were there," Mark snapped. "He must pay half of my fine." "What? Wait. How long have I been asleep? Is today still Saturday?" "Oh, Mark, you're finally home," I said. "I've saved some beer for you." Mark opened the bottle, took a long sip, and immediately winced. "Hey, it's warm." "Sorry," I replied. "It was ice cold when I took it out. I already drank mine while I was waiting for you, but that was before I fell asleep." "You're lying," he said indignantly. "When I took the last photo in the park, it was 11:35. The cops detained me for 10 minutes, and it's not yet noon. The beer wouldn't have time to warm up. You owe me $60. "Wait a minute," I said. "The fine for exceeding 10 miles is only $100. "I only have 80, he said, "and I need at least 40 for a date tonight." "Maybe you should pay the fine and stay home," I suggested. "Dad, warm beer sucks," Mark said. "I want something else." "No, Mark," I said. "You know the rule." Mark nodded, and suddenly George got involved in our conversation. "I don't like him drinking at all," George said. Miri looked at him, as did Cora. Mark gave George an angry look. "He shouldn't drink at all." "How is this any of your business, Mr. Wilson?" Mark Jr. asked coldly. "Mark lives alone at the university. If he wanted, he could walk around drunk half the time he was there. We allow him 1 bottle of beer a day while he is at home. This does no harm and helps him to treat alcohol calmly, so that in the future it does not seem like a forbidden fruit that he will reach for without looking back." What I thought was my reasonable argument was ignored. George clearly wasn't listening. "It makes sense," Cora said. "Will someone turn on the damn grill?" Miri screamed. I couldn't understand why she was so angry. There was tension in the air. I felt it. Something was brewing, and I knew it was going to be bad. But I couldn't even imagine how much worse things would turn out than I thought. "I'm sick of your constant disrespect for me," George suddenly said to Mark. "And I'm sick of you meddling in everything we do," Mark snapped. "Why can't you just sit and be silent? Ever since I was a child, you've always been watching me." George blushed sharply, his face so red that he looked like he would either explode with rage or clutch his heart and collapse to the ground. I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before, complete despair mixed with anger. "I studied as hard as I could to make my parents proud and to build a successful career," Mark Jr. continued, seething with anger. "I have a lot of friends at university, but I miss my mom and dad, so I come home on the weekends to relax and spend time with my family. I wanted to eat my mom's pancakes, have fun with my dad, and do all the stupid things we usually do together. But now you've been following us everywhere all day. I don't mind when you come to visit, but be a good guest and at least try not to interfere in our affairs." It seemed to me that George was about to explode, like an overheated boiler. His hands were shaking. He had difficulty controlling himself. "I have as much right to talk about you as anyone else," he suddenly shouted in a broken voice. "When I get home, my dad, of course, wins the race because he cheats by not telling me about the police radar. And when I get angry and just need to relax with a beer, you start preaching again." Mark Jr. just couldn't help himself now. There are millions of children around the world that you could have adopted and ruined their lives, but no, you chose me. And guess what? Nobody wants to hear your opinion. I was about to intervene to calm the situation when George suddenly exploded. His voice cut through thunder, which stopped all the noise in the area. His next words hung in the air like a dark omen. When I am your father. These four words thundered so loudly that time seemed to stand still. Everything froze. The birds fell silent. The wind died down, and all heads turned to him. Cora looked at George with a stunned expression on her face, as if her mind could not understand the meaning of what she had heard. I froze, as if struck by thunder. Miri stood, dropping the tray of steaks, her eyes full of horror and pain. And Mark Jr. stood in front of George, his eyes burning brightly with hatred. Now I understand everything, he hissed through his teeth, his face contorted with rage. You're just crazy. You have never been and will never be my father. You are nothing to me. And from now on you are even less than nobody. I'm sorry, Mark, George whispered quietly, realizing he had just ruined everything. He tried to take a step back, but it was too late. Miri burst into tears and ran into the house, covering her face with her hands. What's happening? Cora finally spoke. Will someone explain to me what's going on here? It seems that your husband and my wife were much closer than we thought, I said quietly, holding back the raging hurricane inside. Are they relatives? Cora asked, still not understanding the situation. Dad, is this a joke? Mark Jr. asked, but his voice was full of doubts. No, I said evenly, at the same time as George. For a second, George looked at me in horror. He realized that he had said too much. I stepped towards him and, without hesitation, hit him. Get up, you bastard, I shouted, about to hit him again. Miri ran up from behind and grabbed my hand. Mark, if you kill him, you'll go to jail, and he's not worth it, she said, sobbing. I pushed her hand away as if it was burning me. As the woman who slept with him says, yes, Miriam, I spat. He's worth ruining our marriage and our entire 25 years together, but he's not worth me going to jail. How stupid this is. 4 hours ago, I thought that I would gladly die for you, but now I can't look at you. Get away from me. Her face contorted in pain as if I had hit her. She collapsed to the ground and began to sob again. I turned around and calmly walked into the house. I took the keys from the kitchen and headed to the car. 1,000 thoughts were spinning in my head as I slammed the door and started the engine. The last thing I heard before leaving was Cora's voice. Does this mean there will be no steaks? She said. I'm already so in the mood for steaks. Miriam. I didn't understand how I continued to breathe. Even as I sobbed like a newborn baby, my lungs continued to take in air. If I had been smarter, I would have realized that the very fact that I was crying meant that I was breathing. I didn't know why the world kept turning, why the sun was still shining, but it all kept happening. Life went on as usual around me. I heard the sound of the car door as Mark drove away. That sound meant the man I loved was leaving in anger for the first time in our 25 years of marriage. I wanted to go after him, but I simply didn't have the strength. Everything around me, this entire yard, was built, arranged, planted, and cared for by the labor and sweat of my family. The wooden deck was built 12 years ago, and my son and I have been updating it every year. Almost from the moment I brought our son home from the hospital, he and Mark were inseparable. They spoke the same, walked the same, loved the same food and cars. They were like brothers. And now my family is destroyed because of one stupid man. No, I was stupid. My family was destroyed because of my fault, because of what I once did. But I always knew that one day it might come up. Deep down, I was always afraid that this moment would come, but until the last moment I hoped that it would never happen. And now everything has collapsed. Even when my mind tried to block out the pain, my brain continued to take in everything that was happening around me. Cora's stupid questions about steak almost didn't reach me, but I heard them anyway. On some level, I was even grateful for her ignorance. In time, she would understand what had happened, and she would be angry. but at that moment she was not fully involved in what was happening. Cora was too kind, albeit naive, and perhaps we can somehow cope with her disappointment. There was also strength in her simplicity. She loved George too much to be angry for a long time. As for George himself, I thought about him least of all. His pain was insignificant to me at that moment. The worst thing was to see my son's look, full of anger and pain. "Is this true, Mom?" he asked again and again, his voice breaking. "Is he really my father? Are you really?" But I couldn't answer. I couldn't deny it. He saw the answer in my eyes. Mark Jr. is a handsome boy, and thank God, he took after me more than George. There were no features of George to be seen in him. But despite his attractiveness, his face at that moment was distorted with rage and hatred. For the first time in my entire life, I was afraid that my own son might hit me. "You are a woman of easy virtue," he hissed through his teeth, so viciously that foam appeared on his lips. His hatred was almost palpable, and a few drops of saliva fell on my face. "Don't you dare talk to your mother like that," George shouted hoarsely, inserting his word again, not realizing that it was better for him to shut up. Mark June's head snapped towards George. His eyes burned with a cold fire, and I saw that the moment our son first felt anything other than contempt for George was the moment he came to hate him. "If you talk to me one more time, I will kill you," he said calmly but threateningly. "You don't exist to me anymore. I don't want to hear anything about you, and I don't want to see you. You are nothing to me." "But we," George tried to say, his voice shaking. "There is no we between us. You are nothing more than dust to me," Mark Jr. shouted. "Leave our house and never come back here again." Then he turned to me. "You deserve to be treated like this too. You both deserve each other." My son also left without saying another word. I heard him slam the car door, and his Mustang roared out of the driveway, just like his dad's car. Both of them reacted the same way by running. "Do I have to leave too?" Cora suddenly asked. "Cora, honey, do you even understand what happened?" I asked, still hoping that she might not realize the scale of the disaster. "You and George had a baby together a long time ago," she replied. "This kid is Mark Jr., and now everyone is mad because Mark Sr. is not his father, but George is. But that was a long time ago, wasn't it? How old is Mark Jr.? He's already an adult." "He's 20, I answered, feeling the tears welling up in my eyes again. "You and George have been married for 30 years. "That's a long time," Cora said thoughtfully. "Think, Cora. That means George cheated on you with me, and I cheated on Mark. We did something terrible," I said, waiting for her reaction. "Oh, that's the thing," she finally replied. "That's why everyone is so angry, and that's why Mark and George don't get along." She frowned. "I guess I should be angry too," she said slowly, as if trying to convince herself of it. I began to cry again, and Cora, despite her own feelings, came over and began to comfort me, slowly stroking my back. "I never wanted this," George whispered, still standing nearby. "None of this. I just wanted to be a part of something. Sorry, Miri." He slowly stood up and walked towards Cora. She was already beginning to understand what had happened and looked at him with obvious anger, but remained silent. He carefully took her hand. "Come on, Cora," he said. "We need to talk." Cora was silent, but went with him. And now I was left alone. I was left alone, and this fact seemed to press on me with incredible force. The whole world around me continued to exist as if nothing had happened, but for me it ceased to exist. Everything inside was empty, and the pain squeezed my heart to such an extent that it became difficult to breathe. I slowly stood up and walked into the house, locking the door behind me as if that could protect me from what had happened. As I walked through the rooms, I closed the curtains, blocking the sunlight. This house was our castle, the place where we built a life, raised our son, and loved each other. But now it has become for me a cage filled with the ghosts of our mistakes. I leaned against the kitchen table, holding my head in my hands. How could things go so wrong? For so many years I lived, trying to keep this secret that was gnawing at me from the inside, and hoped that the truth would never come out. And now, because of 4 words that came out of George's mouth, my life was ruined. I reached for the phone. My first instinct was to call Mark, ask for forgiveness, beg him to come back and talk to me. But when I picked up the phone and dialed his number, I heard the call go straight to voicemail. He has already blocked me. This realization came with a cold blow of reality. I tried calling our son. The same. His phone number was also inaccessible to me. My hands shook and the phone fell to the floor, but I didn't even notice it. I walked slowly to the bedroom, still hoping that I would find some kind of solace. I collapsed on the bed and burst into tears again. I wanted this day to be just a bad dream from which I could wake up. Memories of our lives flashed through my head every morning, every family dinner, all the moments of happiness that now seemed like an illusion. I've always loved Mark. He was the only one who truly owned my heart. I never wanted to cheat on him. I didn't want to destroy what we built. That fateful night with George was a mistake that happened on the spur of the moment and fear of the future. George and I were drunk, and I was filled with doubts about my marriage. But I never thought that this mistake would ruin everything. Lost in my thoughts, I didn't notice how several hours had passed. I only remembered that time passed slowly, as if in some terrible nightmare. I tried calling Mark again, but to no avail. A feeling of complete helplessness tore me from the inside. I knew he wouldn't be coming back anytime soon, and this realization brought with it a new blow of pain. I would like to tell him that I love him more than anything in the world, that that mistake of 20 years ago never mattered to me. She was nothing compared to what we lived together. But how can he be expected to believe it now? I heard the shower in the guest room running. This meant that Mark had returned, but he was avoiding me. My heart sank when I realized that he did not want to be near me. When the shower turned off, I decided that despite his anger, I still had to be with him. I walked to the guest room door and tried to open it. The door was locked. I stood in front of her as if in front of an impenetrable wall. This castle symbolized the abyss that now separated us. We never locked our doors from each other, and this was another blow to my already destroyed heart. I quietly returned to our bedroom, sat on the bed, and stared at one spot on the floor, absorbed in my grief. I realized that everything that happened between us may never come back. Mark Jr. Who am I? This was the question running through my head as I raced back to the university, gripping the steering wheels so tightly my fingers turned white. I was 20 years old, and for those 2 decades I considered myself Mark Dawson's son. Everything I knew about myself was connected to him. But now I was not sure that I knew the answer to a question that ordinary children can easily answer. Who is my father? No matter how much I thought, I couldn't believe what I heard. The man who raised me, the man who was by my side every step of the way, is not my father. Instead, it was George, a neighbor, a family friend, someone I never took seriously. I felt like my world was collapsing like a house of cards. I stopped on the side of the road. I could no longer drive the car because everything was boiling inside. I got out of the car and kicked the tire with such force that I almost sprained my leg. Fragments of memories flashed through my head. How my father taught me to drive, how we spent time together, how he was at all my school events. Who was with me then? A real father or just a man who had to take on this role? These thoughts were driving me crazy. I felt like the whole world was against me. I stood on the side of the road, breathing deeply, trying to pull myself together. But anger, disappointment, and pain continued to eat away at me from the inside. Everything I knew about my life was now in question. I remembered the moments when my father told me that he was proud of me, that I was his son. How can we believe these words now? And most importantly, how could I myself believe that it was all a lie? After several minutes that seemed like an eternity, I decided to move on. I had to find a way to digest it all, although I couldn't wrap my head around anything. I needed to talk to my father, my real father. I knew that only he could explain everything to me. When I arrived at the university, the parking lot was almost empty, which only added to the feeling of loneliness. I got out of the car and headed towards the hostel, thinking that now I would have to stay away from home. I couldn't go back there. I couldn't look at my mother, and especially at George. Their betrayal burned inside like a hot coal. Even thinking that my mother knew about this all these years and hid it from me and my father was unbearable. As soon as I entered my room, I immediately sat on the bed and stared at the wall. The questions in my head hit like hammers. Who am I? Why did Mom hide the truth? What happens next? My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was the father. I picked up the phone without hesitation. "Hi, son." His voice was calm, but I could feel the tension underneath. "Hi, Dad," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady even though I was seething inside. "How are you?" he asked. It was a simple question, but I could tell he really wanted to know how I dealt with it. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "Everything seems wrong. Everything I knew, what I considered my life." "Son, listen to me," he interrupted me gently but firmly. "I understand that this is a blow for you, but you have to understand one thing: nothing has changed for me. You are my son, always have been and always will be. Everything that you and I have gone through, everything that we have done together, it's all real. Blood or not, it doesn't matter. I raised you and you are my son, and that's the most important thing." His words sounded like an anchor in a storm. They gave me a sense of stability that I was missing. I sighed, feeling the tension ease a little. "But what about Mom now? And with George?" I asked. "I don't know that yet," he answered with sadness in his voice. "This is a difficult question, but whatever happens, it's between adults. You have nothing to do with this, and I don't want you to worry about it. To me, you will always be my son." These words calmed me down a little. I knew my father was speaking sincerely, but it was still difficult to accept this new reality. "I love you, Dad," I said, feeling a lump in my throat. "I love you too, son," he replied. "I'll always be there for you, no matter what happens." We said goodbye, and I remained in the silence of my room, thinking about everything that had been said. My father made it clear to me that his attitude towards me would not change, but this did not solve the remaining issues. What should I do with my mother now? How can I forgive her for lying to me my whole life? George Wilson. I didn't know what to feel. On the one hand, I was sad, but another part of me felt relieved. I was finally going to get what was coming to me. Mark was understandably angry. He probably felt betrayed. He probably also felt a deep sense of loss. It was truly a shame. It should never have gone that far. Mark was a strong and handsome guy. I'm sure he'll get over it with time. Maybe someday we can even be friends again. Who knows? Strange things were happening. After all, we have a son together, and we love the same woman. I heard Cora's voice upstairs. She was talking to herself and moving things around. She always cleaned up when she was upset. I hoped she would calm down soon because I would probably need her help to get over this. After all the anger and raw emotion has subsided and coolness has prevailed, we will all talk. Most of my life, I have been a winner. I won in sports. I won at school. I won big in business. I have lived in this house for the last 30 years. I've been friends with Mark and Miri for the last 25 years. 20 years ago, two things happened. First of all, Miriam and I met on a special occasion. It was magical and the best sex I've ever had. We both knew that everything between us had changed forever, and the result of this short relationship was the birth of my son. After this, Miri had to be careful. She tried not to talk to me directly or even look at me because we didn't want our spouses to know that something was going on between us. I started making a hell of a lot more money when I became cool. This was the second thing that happened. I think I could move to a bigger house and a nicer area. But after that first time with Miriam, I couldn't keep my distance from her. She also didn't tell me that Mark was my son. Not that I minded that she named him after my best friend. It would just be nice to know that he was my son from the beginning. I later found out that she herself did not know about it until he was 5 years old, and probably would never have told me. In fact, I found out about this completely by accident. One day I came home for lunch because Cora, as usual, had done something stupid. Now, I don't remember what exactly. but I'm glad it happened. I remember hearing screams from the neighbor's yard, and since we were all best friends, I ran outside to find out what happened. I thought that perhaps Miriam had cut the wrong plant or suffered some minor injury. None of these assumptions were even close to the truth. I jumped over the fence because in those days we didn't have the gates that now allow passage between yards. I saw Miriam kneeling on the grass in her yard, sobbing. No, she continued to sob again and again. This is impossible. It's not fair. I walked up to her and she stared at me. Get out of my yard, she screamed. Stay away from me. I realized that she, like me, had difficulty containing the emotions that we felt for each other. She had a few pieces of paper in her hands that she was clutching tightly, and I thought it was something simple or financial that I could help her with and use it as an excuse to get close to her again. It's been over 5 years since we had sex, but not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about it. Miriam, no matter what happens, I will make it right, I said. Do you need money? I carefully took the sheets from her and looked at them. These were not financial documents or accounts. It was some kind of laboratory report. What is this? I asked. Mark starts school next month, she said through tears. They asked for a DNA sample for his medical records. Okay, how much does it cost? I asked. We already took the test, asshole, she said. Here is the report. What's the problem? I asked. The problem is, she said, not that it's any of your business, but this report says Mark is not our son's father. These tests are considered very accurate, I said. Miriam, did you have sex with anyone other than Mark? Just this once, bastard, she shouted, and then ran into the house. I spent the rest of the day balancing between delight and shame, with a dash of confusion thrown in as well. I was confused for a while. Like I said, I'm a winner. I always had everything. I have the best job. I make more money than I need. I have a beautiful wife with large breasts who is almost half my age. And I have the best friend in the world. But for the last 5 years, I've been jealous of Mark. Cora is younger and prettier than Miriam. She has much larger breasts and longer legs. On paper, most people would say I won this fight in a landslide. The problem is that real life isn't all about battles and measurements. There are all kinds of intangible factors that need to be considered. The bark is as empty as it is beautiful. I had no doubt at the time that Cora loved me, but she couldn't help herself. I was often jealous of Mark because of the way he and Miriam interacted. They loved each other in a way that clearly surpassed what Cora and I had. My affair with Miriam showed me that I had failed in another sense. I've been with a lot of women in my life, but I've never felt anything like what I felt with Miriam. Mark and I were the closest of friends, and he told me a few things over the years. I chalked it up to the fact that he was just bragging. But when I felt it, it drove me crazy. I realized then that much of what he said could be true. When I found out that she was pregnant, I became even more jealous. I went out of my way to have sex with Cora every night, trying to even the score. I thought that our children would also be best friends, and if they were of different genders, perhaps they would even get married and unite our families. But nothing happened. I started taking the pill and had sex with Cora twice a day for several months, and still nothing. We both underwent medical examinations, and still nothing. We went to specialists and Cora was put on fertility drugs, but still nothing happened. Apparently, it was simply not fate. But that day, when I saw Miriam run into the house crying, I knew that I was a winner again. I was fine. Cora just had another defect. I wish I had known this sooner, so I could have watched Miriam's body change as our son grew in her belly. But at the time, I was so obsessed with trying to create a miracle that I missed this moment. I felt bad for my best friend when the pregnancy got difficult and Miriam had to go to the hospital. In the end, the birth was so difficult that both mother and child barely survived. Doctors told Mark and Miriam that another pregnancy could kill her. Although they both wanted to have more children, Mark didn't hesitate. He voluntarily went for the procedure. The doctor told him that it was a good idea, but it would be better if Miriam had the procedure done. It would be a 100% guarantee of safety. I wonder if he would have been so willing to undergo the operation if he had known earlier that our son was not his. Whenever we talked about children, Mark always said that they didn't need other children because everything worked out perfectly with the first one and there was no need to repeat it. Everyone knew that there was sadness hidden in his words, which he tried to hide, but could not. I once heard Miriam tell Cora that they had always dreamed of a house full of children, but if Mark had to choose between having more children and keeping Miriam, he would always choose Miriam. I heard Mark say more than once that Miriam was his soul. He actually said it out loud and in public, and it was clear that he meant it. "Why don't you ever talk about me like that?" Cora asked one day. I just shrugged. "Some of us show it through our actions," I said. But in my mind I added, "because I just don't feel that way about you." After the news of the baby broke, I gave Miriam a few days to calm down. Then I called her to talk. "Miriam, what should we do now?" I asked. "What should we do about what?" she asked. "About our son," I said. "We don't have a son," she hissed. "You have nothing to do with him. You have nothing to do with me. Nothing." I have to admit, her words hurt. I have always considered us one big family. Mark and I are like brothers, and our wives are like sisters. Admittedly, much of the time that Mark and I spent together was now taken up by his affairs with Mark Jr., but I had not been jealous until that moment. In fact, throughout the boy's life, I was allowed to attend quite a few of his events. However, Miriam did her best to keep us at a distance. If I asked to go to one of his football games, Miriam always gave me the wrong date, place, or time. I was also never invited to his birthdays, and Miriam never allowed me to give the boy a single birthday or Christmas gift. The strangest thing about it was that Cora was allowed to do whatever she wanted with Mark Jr. at any time. Cora was his godmother and Mark's boss was his godfather, which really annoyed me. Mark Jr. called my wife Aunt Cora and called me Mr. Wilson. It seemed that for him I was that angry old man from the TV show Dennis the Tormentor. Miriam decided we shouldn't discuss this over the phone. The next day I went to their house, ostensibly to help Miriam move some boxes while Mark was at work. "What happened, happened," she said. "There is no way to fix this, otherwise I would have done it already. You should just stay away from my son and me. It was a mistake. You took advantage of me 5 years ago and made me do something stupid that I've regretted ever since." She said this with such anger and hatred. She wanted her words to hurt me. But I knew the real reason. She didn't want our feelings to ruin our marriages. "Miriam, I won't tell anyone about what happened or about our son," I said. "But in exchange for this, you must do something for me." "What?" she spat with venom. "Isn't what you've already done to my life enough? What else do you want?" I said. "I want to relive what we had. If we don't do this, I'll tell Mark everything. I've already been through one divorce, and I'm tired of Cora, so I'm not afraid to go through it again, but you'll lose everything that's dear to you." She cried a lot, but agreed. She had no choice. We only meet twice a year, which annoys me, but she claims she doesn't want that at all. This usually happens on Mark Jr.'s birthday to remind her why we are doing this, and on my birthday as my special gift. This has been going on for almost 15 years, and we have never been caught. There were a few times when we had to reschedule or just miss appointments, but it never stopped. In fact, it's one of the things I'm looking forward to the most. And now, because of my inability to control my anger, everything has come to light. I have no idea how everything will be resolved now. Deep down, I hope that everything will calm down and return to normal. Mark will probably be angry for quite some time, but at least now he will know. Well, almost everything. I hope Miriam is smart enough not to tell him that this happened more than once. But if she doesn't tell him we're still involved, I'll still have leverage over her. As for my son, he still has a lot to understand. Now that he knows that I am his father, a lot will have to change. I'm willing to be generous. I'm not going to cut Mark out of our lives. He will be allowed to participate in all our affairs with his son. This is much better than how they treated me. Ideally, I would like Mark to realize that as a friend, He should be willing to make sacrifices in exchange for all the years I gave him with my son. Over the past 15 years, I've had to stand by and watch as my child is gradually turned into a clone of Mark. I had no say in the important decisions of his life. I was simply a bystander to his triumphs and failures. And even though Mark didn't know that Mark Jr. was my son, I still suffered. So, if he were a true friend, he would simply divorce Miriam and disappear. Then my family could mend their relationship, and he could start all over again somewhere else. In an ideal world, he would even take Cora with him, but that would be too much. I smiled just thinking about it, and at that moment, when my smile was at its widest, I saw Cora coming down the stairs. She is carrying 2 suitcases. "Goodbye, George," she says. Her eyes are full of tears, and she just walks away. "Cora, wait," I said, but she doesn't stop. She leaves the house and puts her suitcases in the trunk of her car. I grabbed her hand, but she pushed me away. "I know I'm not very smart," she said, "but I'm a good person, and I loved you with all my heart. I talked to Miriam, George, and I know what you did to her. You are some kind of monster, and I knew about the other women you cheated on me with. But I always thought that, in the end, my love will make you understand that I am the right woman, and we will be happy. I never wanted or asked for perfection. I just wanted someone I could love and who would love me back. And since that doesn't seem to be happening, I'll have to settle for taking all your money. Your lawyer, Stanton Rice, will represent me in our divorce. He is confident that he can get me much more money than our prenuptial agreement signed 30 years ago provided, especially after you admitted in front of witnesses that you cheated on me and fathered another child." I was shocked. Her using my own lawyer was a really smart move. This bastard knew how much money I had and where it was. I felt a lump in my throat. The phone rang in the house, and I ran to answer it. "George, can you come to my place? We need to talk," Miriam said. "Of course, Miri, I'll be right there," I replied. "Don't ever call me that," she hissed. "My name is Miriam. Only my husband calls me Miri. You can call me Mrs. Dawson." I went out the back door and walked up to the gate in the fence. The gate did not open. Then I noticed a large padlock on the other side. I walked back through the house and went to the next house. The door was opened by a crying Miriam. I tried to hug her, but she hit me. She looked worse than I had ever seen her. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But what bothered me most was her eyes. They were alternately dull and lifeless, and then sparkled with almost bestial rage. "Mark will be here in a few minutes," she said. "You're going to stay on this damn porch until he comes." "My, Mrs. Dawson, is our son coming too?" I asked. "You better hope not," she snapped. "The last thing he said about you was that he had to leave you yesterday to avoid killing you. I spoke with my husband Mark this morning. He doesn't want to talk to me because of you. He only reported that Mark Jr. was fine. He went back to college early because he couldn't stand everything that was happening here. My own son doesn't want to talk to me because of you. He hates you, George. Because of your long tongue, we both lost it. Are you happy now?" I was stunned. Things didn't go at all as I expected. "I always hated you, George," she said. "Every time we were together, I did it only so as not to hurt my husband from your threats yesterday, and partly out of selfishness. I thought that, despite all his love for me, Mark, deep down in his soul, would choose a woman who could give him more children. So I assumed that if he found out about us, he would leave me and find someone else. I was so stupid. And you know who opened my eyes to this? Bark. She told me how she wished you would love her half as much as Mark loves me, and I failed him. I won't let him down again, George. And whether he comes back to me or not, I'm going to make sure you suffer. Now sit on this porch and don't move." "But Miri, She hit me again. I was sitting on the porch when Mark's Mustang pulled up. I knew that he and Miriam were still living together, which was more than could be said about me and Cora. I then wondered if Cora and I could work out our differences. As far as I could see, Cora truly loved me and was deeply hurt by what I had done. I have always had a rather neutral attitude towards her. It seems like from the moment Miriam and I first came together, Cora was only in my life to fill a void. Realistically speaking, she would be better off without me. Hopefully, we can come to an agreement that won't be painful for me, but I just didn't see the point in fighting for Cora the way Miriam might have to fight for Mark. Miriam's words echoed in my head. She hates me. My son hates me. I didn't want any of this. As Mark began to climb the steps onto the porch, his cold gaze was far worse than the rage I saw on Miriam's face. It was this coldness and lack of emotion that most made me realize how much I had screwed everything up. Until yesterday, I was a valued member of our family, part of a group of 5. Of course, I wasn't with Miriam, but we were friends, and before Mark started talking about what she was like in bed, I had never even looked at her. That was 20 damn years ago. I continued to pursue her, trying to feel what Mark was describing, and only now I realized that she was only doing this for the sake of the one she loved. And she hates me. Instead of being his father's best friend and the person who would be a mentor in his life if Mark ever died, I jealously tried to force myself into Mark June's life. This only led to him seeing me as some strange old man who was too interested in him. I was never his father. I was just a donor. It was an accident that I became the biological father. If Mark had been home or returned from a business trip earlier, or if Miriam hadn't missed him so much that a little wine and a little more persuasion wouldn't have swayed her. Okay, maybe there was more wine than conviction, but it was an accident. There was never any love or joy in our relationship. I've lost everything. I will probably end my days as a lonely old man, of no use to anyone. I live in a rundown apartment with 15 cats and a closet full of cans of tuna. When Mark approached me on the porch, his cold, impassive gaze was much more terrifying than Miriam's rage. As Mark came closer, I saw a lack of emotion in his eyes that was even worse than anger. This indifference was devastating. It became clear to me that everything I had lost could not be returned. Until yesterday, I was an important part of their lives, a kind of extended family that I put so much effort into. But because of my stupidity, I ruined everything. Mark stopped in front of me and said coldly, "Whatever is in your soul now, it will only get worse." "Mark, I started. "No need," he interrupted me. "I didn't call you here so the two of us could talk. We all need to discuss the future together." When we entered the house, I felt that the atmosphere had changed. The house, which previously seemed filled with warmth and comfort, was now cold and empty. Yesterday there was joy and laughter here, but today this place looked abandoned. All the memories that had seemed so vivid before now seemed like ghosts of what once was. Miriam was sitting at the kitchen table, and when her gaze met Mark's, she reflexively reached for him, but then stopped, as if she realized that she no longer had the right to make such gestures. I saw that her heart was broken, and I realized that I myself had destroyed the very love that I had admired all these years. A feeling of guilt flared up inside me, which was hard to contain. I didn't just destroy their marriage, I destroyed that deep connection that few people had. Anyone who is capable of destroying such love deserves punishment. Mark sat down opposite me and laid out a folder with documents in front of me. "I wanted to start with the other papers first," he said calmly. "But damn it, nothing is going as planned. Yesterday morning, I woke up and considered myself the happiest person in the world. The woman I loved more than anyone in the world had made me feel good in the morning, and we had plans to spend the day with our son. But by mid-afternoon, everything had turned to shit. I lost my son, I lost my wife, I lost my best friend. So, George, no matter how bad you feel right now, know that there is even worse ahead of you." I looked at the documents and felt a chill run down my spine. He sued me for money spent on raising my son. "What nonsense is this?" I shouted. "My lawyer insisted on this," Mark answered evenly. "This is a fairly simple claim. I am suing you for the cost of raising your son from his birth until now. Included are expenses for education, clothing, medical bills, vacations, and everything else. You declared yourself his father yesterday, so now it's time to pay the bills. But this is a lot of money." Before I could finish speaking, He pulled out another folder with documents. "This is an alienation of affection claim," he said. "I don't fully understand this legal term, but the point is that you ruined my relationship with my wife. If it weren't for you, our family would be as happy as always. But she still loves you." I tried to justify myself. "Mark, you demand more than $1 million. "I would like more," he said with obvious contempt. "Miriam was my soul. You ruined it, and now you have to pay for it." Miriam sat up straight, her face streaked with tears. She suddenly spoke, her voice filled with despair. "Mark, I have never loved anyone but you. This bastard couldn't separate us. I only did what I had to do to protect our family. I never wanted you to suffer." Mark looked at her with sadness and disappointment, but there was no former warmth in his eyes. "You will have your opportunity to explain yourself, Miriam," he said. "I won't go anywhere without listening to you. But you lied to me for 20 years. We'll see if I can forgive this." Then he turned to me and said coldly, "George, these documents are only copies. The originals will be delivered tomorrow. I'm warning you in advance because you were once my best friend. We were almost like brothers, but that's in the past. Once this process begins, I don't think we'll ever have to talk again. I'll probably leave here soon." He stood up and handed me the folders. It was like a cold, formal farewell. He dismissed me from his life as a bad deal that did not bring the expected results. I didn't have a chance to say a word or apologize. Miriam. When George walked out of the house with a stunned face, holding those same documents in his hands, I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I kept telling myself that no matter what, Mark still loved me and everything would be okay. But as soon as I looked at him, I realized that something had changed. There was a different look in his eyes than the one he had when he left in the morning. "Where did you go today, honey?" I asked, trying to smile. "My name is Mark," he answered calmly. There was a finality in his tone, as if he was cutting off the part of our lives where we were together. I swallowed, feeling the world around me begin to crumble. "Honey, can we just relax and talk like we always do?" I asked with a smile that usually disarmed Mark. "I already told you," he said with cold calm. "My name is Mark. You can talk as you please. I'm calm, so speak up. You have the floor." He took out his phone and turned on the voice recording app. "Why is this?" I asked. "This is to help you remember what you say and avoid misunderstandings," he replied. "But Mark, we always argue and then make up. It's always been like this. If we buy ketchup, we argue about what size bottle to get. It's just us," I said with a slight smile, trying to diffuse the situation. "But this time it's serious," he said without raising his voice. "And I'm sure we won't make peace this time. Besides, I'm pretty sure that unless you have a miraculous answer, we no longer exists. Miriam, did we even exist?" "What do you want to say, Mark?" I asked, my words trembling with fear. "Of course it was. We have always been together and always will be." "No, Miriam," he continued with the same icy equanimity. "You talk about what you would like to see, your hopes. But let's get back to the real world. I'm talking about facts. Let's stick to the facts, okay?" I was confused again. "Mark, the fact is that I love you and you love me. We are married and we will get through this. It's just an obstacle in our way. We hate obstacles like this. They slow us down, but we overcome them." "Miriam, let's stick to the facts," he said again. "But these are the facts," I insisted. "Mark, I love you and—" "Let's start with this," he interrupted. "Prove it." "What?" I was stunned. "How am I supposed to prove this?" "Miriam, let's see," he said, as if discussing simple arithmetic. "You claim to love me, but you cheated on me for 80% of the time we spent together. In our 25 years of marriage, you were faithful to me for only 5 years. It's a fact, isn't it?" "Yes, but—" I started. "This is not at all like love, Miriam," he said coldly. "You let another man get you pregnant and then forced me to raise his child. Is this also true?" "Yes, but Mark—" I tried to justify myself. "This is also not at all like love. It's more like cheating, he continued. I don't want to see you in prison, Miriam, even though you've deceived me for 20 years, and I can't sue you to get back the money I spent. Our state has a presumption of paternity law. The law states that in a marriage, in the absence of other compelling evidence, the husband is considered to be the father of all children born in the family. Why are we talking about all this? I asked. I want to talk about how we can make things better. Miriam, we. He tried to start, but I interrupted him. Why do you call me Miriam? I asked. You only call me by my full name when you are really angry with me. It hurts, Mark. Doesn't it hurt that I found out that my son is not my son? He hissed. Or does it not hurt that the woman I loved most in my life cheated on me with another man? At least you could leave if you wanted. You had a choice, but I didn't. I didn't know anything. I'm sorry, Mark, I cried. You have no idea how sorry I am. No, Miriam, it's me who regrets, he said bitterly. I feel like I wasted my whole life. All the love and care that I gave you during the 25 years of our marriage and the 2 years before that were in vain. I was stunned. Think about it, Miriam. Every memory I have is now tinged with lies. When we went on vacation, were you really there with me, or were you thinking about him? When you met me at the door and kissed me, were you really happy to see me, or were you just giving him time to leave the house? Every time we made love, it was just out of guilt, and you probably imagined it was him. All our memories mean nothing now. I didn't know what to say. I had no idea his pain was so deep or his anger so intense. Everything turned out to be much worse than I expected. Why don't you say everything you wanted? He said after a pause. We're not getting anywhere, and I have things to do. Mark, you don't understand, I began, trying to stay afloat. I never wanted this. I don't like George. I can't even stand him. Mark suddenly laughed, and this made me cry even harder. If you can't stand him, then why did you have sex with him for 20 years? He asked sarcastically. I had no choice, I stammered. Mark, all this started because of you. You told George about us, about how we make love, and you know what he's like. He thinks he deserves the best. He wanted to try it himself, but I didn't realize it until later. I started telling him the whole story of how this started, hoping that the truth would help win back his trust and love. It all started when you went to that management conference in Indiana, I began, trying to control my voice, but I could feel it shaking treacherously. I missed you terribly. I cried every night while you were away. It was only 5 days, but it seemed like an eternity had passed. On the third night, before you returned, George and Cora came over and we drank some wine. Cora fell asleep on the sofa, and I was apparently drunker than I thought. George helped me up so I could lie down on the other couch and started telling me how sorry he was that you were gone so long. Mark looked at me silently. His face was inscrutable, and his eyes were cold as ice. I knew that this moment decided everything. I had to explain everything correctly. Explain that I didn't want this, that all this time I loved only him. He kept talking about how much you missed me and urged me to imagine that you were already home. I was in such a state. I don't know what came over me. The wine made me lethargic and sleepy. The last thing I remember is him putting me on the sofa, and I fell asleep. I stopped and my hands began to shake. I woke up in shock and immediately made him leave. I kicked him out of the house, and since then, for 5 years, we have not been alone again. I did everything possible to prevent this from happening again. I saw something flash in Mark's eyes. Maybe it was a flash of sympathy. I wanted to believe that he could understand that I wasn't looking for this, that I wasn't cheating on him on purpose. But he remained silent. When you returned, I continued, I decided to forget about it. I decided that maybe I myself somehow pushed him to this. We were drunk, and I was so angry at you for leaving. I convinced myself that it was all my fault. I didn't want to lose you, Mark. You are my life. He didn't say a word. He just nodded his head, inviting me to continue. I felt like I had to finish. 6 weeks later, I found out we were pregnant, and I simply forgot about George. I blocked him from my life. Let me ask you, Mark, were we happy during my pregnancy and those first few years? Yes, we were, he said. Mark, I had no idea that Mark Jr. wasn't yours. In fact, I only found out about it when he was 5 years old. This was shown by the DNA test that Mark Jr. had to take before school. George heard me crying and came running to find out what was wrong. As soon as he found out, he started pressuring me to keep quiet about it. It wasn't sex, Mark, and it only happened twice a year. I just put up with it to protect my family. I couldn't lose you, Mark. This is the mindset that helped me get through it. I told myself I was doing this to protect my people. He never got what he wanted, Mark. He never got me as you know me. There was no kissing, no real intimacy. Neither of us said anything for a long time. He just looked at me, and I could tell that no matter how hard he tried to remain distant, he was on the verge of tears. Miriam, I don't want you to get hurt, he said. I don't want you to be poor and lonely. I want us to split everything in half. You get half, and I'll get the other half. I'll send you half of my check. If you don't mind, I'd prefer the check be deposited directly into your account and— Mark, what the hell are you talking about? I asked. I felt that my vision began to approach me from all sides. I also had breathing problems. I put my hands on the table to steady myself. Mark looked like he wanted to comfort me. He reached for my shoulder and then pulled his hand away as if he had been burned. This hurt me more than anything. What the hell is wrong with you? I asked. I'm very sorry, he said. I didn't want to do. What didn't you want to do? I asked. You didn't want to touch me. So, you tell me that in 24 hours I have turned from the woman you love more than anything in the world into some sick woman of easy virtue whom you are afraid to touch. Are these my purulent wounds visible now, Mark? Or— I cried. I really wanted him to touch me. I didn't expect this at all. Miriam, this is not at all the same, he said sadly. But we can't be. We just have to get used to the fact that things will be different. You don't. I'm not. What the hell? I screamed. I'm not perfect. So you're right, Mark. I'm not perfect. And now that you have the chance, you want to go and leave me for someone who's younger, who runs every day like you and works and all that. To hell with you, Mark. I know I'm not perfect, but I've never been like that. The only person who ever thought I was beautiful or special was you, dumbass. But I can damn sure guarantee you that she will never love you as much as— Miriam, that's not what I meant at all, he said. You mentioned yesterday. I guess it all depends on yesterday, doesn't it? Yesterday I thought you were the most beautiful and most special woman in the world. And maybe you weren't perfect then either, but you were perfect for me. I love every wrinkle on your face. You have the softest and most wonderful ass on the planet. I've already gotten in trouble for telling that asshole about how good you are in bed and how special you made me feel. None of this has changed, Miriam. Not one iota was I trying to say that I can't keep reaching out to touch you or hug you because whether you want to admit it or not, everything changed yesterday. Miriam, this is a fact. We can't avoid it or pretend nothing has changed because everything is different, and the biggest change is that you're not mine. My brain refused to process this thought. It was as if he had just said a mathematical formula with 10 to 15-digit numbers and was expecting me to give him the answer. My synapses understood what was needed, but I simply didn't have the processing power to find the answer. It's as if it's simply impossible to imagine a world in which the two of us weren't together. I stared at him blankly, and I could tell that he even reeled from what he said. But looking into his eyes, I saw that although it was painful for him to say these words, he meant them. If saying those words was a punch to the jaw, then realizing that he not only meant it, but believed those blasphemous words to be true was a punch to the gut. I think that if I had a choice between Mark telling me what he just said or him hitting me like he hit George the day before, I would take the hit. Miriam, you must understand this, he said. I have always built everything in my life around us. I knew that we loved each other, and that because of this, nothing that happened really affected me. I knew that you and I would be together until one of us died. And even then, if you had died first, I wouldn't have lived long. I didn't even call you Miriam. I called you Miri because I needed to come up with my own little name for you. Because you were not only mine, you were a part of me. Fuck you, Mark, I spat. I will listen to your stupid words, but only to hear what you think about it. I find it funny that you came here and told me that we should be logical and deal with facts when you are just talking complete nonsense. Deep down, I know how I feel about you. This has never changed. I'm the same woman you married, Mark. I'd take a bullet for you, and you know it. And I'll tell you something else. I'm looking into your eyes now and you're failing. You wanted to come here, say a few sly things, and be done with it all. You expected me to do this, just walk away with my tail between my legs and let myself ride off into the sunset, and then go and find myself a 45-year-old former Victoria's Secret model to be happy with. But this won't happen. I will fight every attempt to separate us. I will distort, delay, and finally defeat any divorce, and most importantly, I will never give up on us. Miriam, he began again, as if I hadn't spoken. Yesterday, I realized that my fundamental belief has always been wrong. I think I always thought that even before we got married, we were a couple. I thought that we belonged together and that you were mine and mine alone. I interrupted. Miriam, for at least the last 20 years I have shared you with George, he said calmly. I never knew this and would never agree to this. My wife should be my wife, not our wife. Every memory I have now needs to be reworked. My mouth dropped open. Mark, this doesn't look like. I muttered. Not more than 24 hours ago, you woke me up, the happiest person, Miriam. If it had been up to me and Mark Jr. hadn't interrupted us, we'd be in bed together right now. Do you remember the last thing you said to me back then? Damn it, Miriam, I don't even let anyone drive my Mustang. Why would I share something as important as my wife with anyone? He actually yelled at me. Even before this, he said, you told me that you never made love to anyone but me. He calmed down to the point that he no longer screamed, but there was still venom in his voice. His voice was so hoarse and so rough that I felt his pain in every word. Another fucking lie, Miriam, he said sarcastically. So if you look at it from my point of view, I have to question everything you've ever told me. I'm not even sure the USA ever existed. The woman I fell in love with and married probably doesn't exist anymore. I know you're not her. My Miri would never do this. So, Miriam, can we go back to where we were before we lost our way? I simply nodded. I wanted to stop talking. I just wanted to end this conversation. More than anything, I wanted us to finish this, and then make up, go upstairs to our room and go to bed. We didn't even have to make love. I just wanted him to hold me and tell me everything would be okay. It's just going to take time, Miri. He told me so many times that I could imagine him saying it right now. Everything will work out, Miri. It's just going to take time. So, what check were we talking about? I asked to change the subject. My salary, Miriam, he said. I will give you half of this amount so that you can have some income. Don't you remember what we talked about? Mark, we are pensioners, remember? I asked. I began to think that what happened between us had driven him over the edge, too. Miriam, I'm back to work, he said. I had to. We're not rich like George. When we retired, it was based on the premise that we were going to live together. We have enough invested to provide income for the rest of our lives, plus my 401k and Social Security. Remember? He asked. I nodded. Miriam, the problem is that we've factored in 1 or 2 holidays every year, plus a rainy day fund, and we've doubled most of our bills, but we never imagined we'd be supporting separate families. This means that even if one of us stays in this house that's paid off, we'll still have to add the mortgage and property taxes or rent, plus extra insurance, plus even more bills into the equation, and that's the only way for us to swing than there is if I go back to work. If, and this is doubtful, but if I receive money from George in any of my claims, it will also be divided between us, but I will give most of it to Mark Jr., because he suffered as much from this deception as I did. Mark, I don't understand any of this, I said. Can you start again? It would be nice to get some money from George. I'm suing him too. But I don't understand anything you said. Yesterday, we were planning to go to Barbados, And now suddenly we don't have enough money and we need another house. What's wrong with the house we live in now? I don't want to live anywhere else. I thought we had abandoned the very idea of a country house. Remember, you yourself said that trying to maintain too many houses would be more effort than we wanted to expend. You kept saying we were retiring, so we just want to relax and have fun together. I want to live here. Miriam, I also need somewhere to live, he said irritably. He kept looking at me as if I just didn't understand him. Mark, what don't you like about our house? I asked him. I love this house, he said. Then why can't we live here? I asked. If we move, won't we get a lot of money when we sell the house? Suddenly, I thought I understood. Mark, you're afraid of George, aren't you? I laughed. Or you just don't trust me around him. You're afraid and jealous that your wife will succumb to the charms of the super sexy George Wilson. You're afraid I'll start again with the asshole who's been blackmailing me into having sex with him this whole time. You don't have to worry about that, Mark. This will never happen again, Miriam, we need another house because we are not going to live together, he said. I stopped laughing and my smile faded. Miriam, we can't handle this. I can't, he said. I think we need a divorce. That's why I was trying to look at the bills and figure out how much money we needed and what we could and couldn't afford. Mark, can't we? I started. He simply shook his head. Miriam, you have hurt me too much, he said. I don't know what to do or even who I am anymore. I'm really thinking about leaving this area. Maybe I need to start over. Mark Jr. thinks about it too. He's looking at a lot of different cities in his career and what the job prospects are like. As for me, a good engineer can work anywhere. I thought you'd probably stay here or move to Richmond with your sister and her family. I'm very sorry, but I think it's for the best. I was stunned. I couldn't think of anything to say. I'll bring you the divorce papers as soon as you find a lawyer. To save money, we could even hire the same person to handle both sides. I want to be as fair as possible, Miriam. I really want us to meet with something that is fair for both of us and allows us both to have what we want, he said. Mark, this would be the easiest thing in the world, and it wouldn't require any money or lawyers, I said. All I want is you. 2 days later, Mark and I went to his lawyer's office. I watched as they filled out the documents. We made several different sets. One if I want to live in a house, one in case Mark stays in the house, and one in case we decide to sell the house and we both live elsewhere. The only thing I repeated throughout the entire process was that I did not want a divorce and would never agree to one. Once the paperwork was completed, Mark helped me find another attorney who could act in my best interests. She looked over the papers and, after asking about the reason for our divorce, told me that the agreement, considering what had happened, was extremely fair and that Mark could probably try to sue me the same way he sued George. She also told me to take any of them and move on because most judges wouldn't give me what I was getting. I told her that I knew Mark would never try to scam me. In fact, he was going to pay me half of his salary for as long as he continued working. Most judges would limit the sentence to 8 to 10 years at most. She noted that there was a contingency that the payments would stop if I got married again. I just laughed at her. I told Mark that I didn't understand the need for another lawyer at all. He told me that he wanted me to have someone who cared only about me. This way I could be sure that he and his lawyer were not trying to punish me or deceive me. I laughed again. After the meeting, the lawyer asked me to stay for a few minutes. I asked Mark if this was possible. He told me to take as much time as I needed. The lawyer asked me why I asked his permission. I explained to her that we went to her office together. "Do you still live together?" she asked. "Of course," I said. "Why not?" "But you're going through a divorce," she said. "Everything seems friendly now, but what happens when you start fighting and arguing about something? What happens when you both want something or you both don't want something?" "We're talking about this," I said. "And if I really want something, all I have to do is ask. Believe me, we love each other. I really should kick his ass for bringing me here in the first place." "So you two are fighting. Do you want me to get you a restraining order so he can't come into the house?" she asked. Are you crazy? I asked. Can you get it so he must stay a certain distance away from me? I don't want him to move away from me. Then why are you getting divorced? She asked. The settlement was extremely fair. Why do you need me? I didn't think we made it, I said. He insisted that I hire someone to protect my interests. He didn't want to have two lawyers throughout the whole process because it would just cost us more money. First of all, I don't need lawyers. Do you even want a divorce? She asked. No, I said. I want to save my marriage. Then let's do it, she said, smiling. I will seek advice, and I will file a petition to prohibit him from paying any of the family property for 90 days. This will make it impossible for him to move. You're fired, I said. But why? She asked. I'm just trying to do what's in your best interest. We may even file a petition to dismiss the divorce petition. You don't care about my interests, I said. All you care about is your own interests, which would be best served by billing me for a few hours. I wish you a brilliant day. Mark and I went home. On the way, I reached out and tried to hold his hand. Mark, I don't want a divorce, I told him. This is a waste of time and money that we simply don't have. I want a house. I know I shouldn't ask you for anything because I'm the one who ruined our marriage. But deep down in my heart, I don't think we're done. I love you too much for that. The only reason either of us would want a divorce is so we might get married again. I'm not going to be with anyone but you. I want a house because I'm sure you and I will end up there together. So you sort out the bills and everything and just leave me the house so we don't lose it. Then you go out and find your supermodel. You will live with her and do whatever you are going to do. I owe you 15 years and a day. If you decide to marry her or not, come back to me after this time. I will give you a divorce. Can we do this, please? I asked. I like to think that God, or fate, or whatever it is, smiled on me because Mark agreed to it. He still decided to give me half of his check and half of everything else. I tried to argue with him, saying that I was the one who cheated, so he deserved most of our assets, and since I kept the house, our agreement was extremely one-sided. This was one way to find out that Mark still loved me. The hardest day of my life was the day he moved into his apartment. I cried my eyes out even though I knew it would happen. Mark took very little furniture or anything other than his personal belongings and tools. I knew he didn't want the house to feel different. I hid some of his old sweatshirts in one of my drawers to preserve them. He had worn them recently, so they still smelled like him. I have never wanted anything in my life as much as I wanted my husband to stay with me, but there was nothing I could do about it. Mark warned me. He told me the exact day of his move, and I prayed that time would stand still, but of course it didn't. Even worse were the people he forced to help him move. He had two guys he worked with, our son and a girl who could become my daughter-in-law. Mark Jr. never said a word to me. Mark had to tell him several times that he was raised to be polite to people and to speak up when spoken to. Anger was not a reason to forget your manners. This gave me all 9 words. 1 word for every month I carried him in my womb. Hello, Mom. Sorry, I have work, he said. Then he walked away. I'm sorry, Miriam, Mark said. He's still in a lot of pain. Before he left, Mark gave me the check. He settled out of court with George for about half the amount he wanted in the alienation of affection claim. He wanted $500,000, and George shelled out half that amount, thinking he had a deal. George's lawyers tried to get him to settle as many claims as possible. No matter how it ends, George will end up broke. Cora tried to take everything George had. Mark had 2 lawsuits against George, the biggest of which was yet to come. I also filed a lawsuit against him. Apparently George couldn't leave him alone, though, because he walked over and handed Mark a paper saying he was filing a counterclaim against Mark and me for denying him access to his son. His grin angered Mark Jr., and George ran across the yard with my son in pursuit. If Mark had not called him back, Mark Jr. could have seriously hurt George. Fuck you. I don't want to be your father anyway, George shouted. You never were, Mark Jr. retorted. Even if I knew, I wouldn't want anything to do with you. After that day, I was afraid that I would never see my people again. It took us 2 weeks to get back together. From the first day Mark left, George tried to move. He often sat in his yard and watched me work in my house. He even came up and knocked on the door several times. Finally, 2 weeks after Mark left, George cut the lock on the gate in the fence and entered my yard. "Miriam, this is stupid," he said. "We have been friends for more than 20 years. Cora left me. Mark left you. Our son left us both. We're all alone. We should be together." He reached out to try to stroke my hand, and I moved it, knocking my cell phone and glass of lemonade off the table. "We had a good time together for many years, Miriam. In fact, that's why I didn't try to convince Cora to stay with me. I hoped that you and I would have a chance. Maybe I won't be able to be a father. I'm sorry. I say this, but Mark has clearly turned our son against both of us." He reached for my hand again. "I think we should go to your house and get back to what we're doing. And now that Mark is gone, I can have all of you, not just part of you." "Get away from me, asshole," I said. "You ruined my life and my marriage. Because of you, I lost the only man I ever loved and my son. Get away from me, loser." When I said loser, something changed in George's eyes. He grabbed me. That's exactly where we were when the heads of 2 police officers poked their heads around my fence on the other side. I called them just as George started cutting the lock off the fence. George ended up having to move into a hotel because the restraining order I had against him meant he couldn't stay in his own home until we went to court. The restraining order also helped me pursue a civil suit against George. Unfortunately, I never managed to collect a penny. When the police arrived, Mark stopped. The police took George and kept him overnight. Mark told George's lawyer that he wanted to get together to discuss settling the child support claim. In fact, they have not decided anything, and the matter will be resolved in the presence of a mediator. This happened later, but Mark still didn't want it. Mark followed George out of the lawyer's office and beat him up. George spent 3 days in the hospital and Mark spent 3 days in jail. George agreed to drop the charges against Mark if I dropped the lawsuit against him. As usual, I needed to protect my people, so I agreed. George ended up paying Mark to raise Mark Jr., and the judge refused to hear George's counterclaim. He said that George was a reprehensible person, and there was no evidence that George ever asked to see Mark Jr. or that we refused to allow it, especially since Mark never knew about Mark Jr.'s paternity. Mark again gave me a check for a third of the amount received from the claim. He gave the other third to Mark Jr. He even convinced Mark Jr. to bring me a check. This happened on the same day that George sold his house. Both of Mark's lawsuits bled his finances dry, and George was nearly bankrupt. He had to sell the house and move to a much smaller place because his divorce from Cora was eating up his legal fees. George wanted everything, but in the end, he seemed to get nothing. When Mark Jr. brought the check, I asked him if everything was okay with his father. After Mark beat George up and went to jail because of me, I didn't see him. "He's fine," my son said. "Moreover, he has a date today." I wasn't sure if my son said this to hurt me or just because he didn't want to be around me and wanted to get off quickly. It seems he didn't even notice how tears were streaming down my cheeks when he left. I knew it was possible, but I hoped Mark would never find another woman. I never expected this to happen so soon. Yes, I told Mark to find another woman, but damn, I didn't really mean it. I knew roughly where Mark's new apartment was, so one day I followed him from work to find out the exact address. He never invited me to his place, so I didn't have his address. Having recognized him, I waited and watched for several days. Hell, I'm still retired and have plenty of free time. Finally, after a week, I received my reward. Mark pulled up in his Mustang and was immediately approached by a woman. She had bags as if she was going to the grocery store. Apparently, she had come to cook him dinner. I hated this bitch at first sight. Mark did exactly what I told him. She was much younger than us. She had long dark hair and was very beautiful. My husband was 55 damn years old. This woman could not have been more than 40. As they turned and walked towards his apartment, the creep tried to kiss him. I ran back to my car and could barely stop myself from bursting into tears until I got home. When I returned, I poured out all my pent-up anger. I cried almost all night. I even ignored the phone when it rang. The calls kept coming, and eventually I had to answer. When I picked up the phone, trying to calm down so as not to cry in case of a serious call, I heard screams. "Mom, Dad is in the hospital. I know we're not talking, but please go there. It takes me at least an hour to get there. Once I arrive, you can do whatever you want, okay? I'm on my way." Suddenly, my thoughts became clearer, and I knew what I needed to do. I grabbed my keys and was out of the house in less than a minute. I was furious with my son. How could he assume that I wouldn't go to the hospital? Taking care of his father is much more my business than his. Mark was still my husband, no matter what he or our son might think. I wasn't going to stand by if something happened to one of them. On the way, I tried to calm down. That unpleasant feeling in my stomach that I had been experiencing lately returned again. I decided to go to the hospital pharmacy and get heartburn pills. I was wondering how Mark's new girlfriend was handling this situation and how she was feeling now. Judging by the way she curled around him as they walked to his apartment, I was sure she would be in the hospital. For Mark's sake, I was going to be polite and considerate with her. When I arrived at the hospital, I ran to the front desk to find out where Mark was and what had happened to him. The woman at the counter was surprisingly ignorant. She looked up his name and then looked at me. "How are you related to him?" she asked. "I'm his wife," I answered sharply. "Sorry, madam, but can you prove it?" she asked. I angrily rummaged through my bag and showed her my driver's license. She smiled. "Sorry, madam. Usually, if you know the patient is here, we can tell you which room they are in. But in this case, since he is involved in a criminal investigation, security measures have been strengthened. He's in room 514. I got into the first elevator I could find and went to the 5th floor, counting off the numbers until I found room 514. A uniformed policeman was standing at the door. I didn't think anything of it and reached out to open the door. But the policeman extended his hand, stopping me. "You cannot come in here, madam," he said. "Who will stop me?" I barked. "Officer, you better let her in," Mark said. His voice was weak, as if he was in pain or very tired. I rushed into the room. Mark had a bandage on his head, lay on the bed with a pipe in his hand, and could barely keep his eyes open. I ran to the bed and fell on him. "Damn," he said. "Do all the women in the world really want to kill me?" "Sorry, honey," I said. "Sorry it took me so long to come, but Mark Jr. just called me." Mark looked exhausted. His words were slow, like a drunk. "Honey, what happened?" I asked. "Love you, Miri," he mumbled and fell asleep. Then I started crying quietly. I didn't know what was wrong with him, and I think not knowing was the worst part. "Whatever it is, we will get through it together." I sat on the chair next to his bed, holding his free hand. I warily watched every person who entered the room. His nurse smiled at me as she took his vital signs and nodded her head. "His heartbeat is still too slow for a man his age," she said with an annoyed expression. "He's such a good person. When they find the people who hurt him, I hope they throw away the key." "What's his pulse?" I asked. "I can't disclose patient information," she said. "His son is coming here and—" My mind broke and I attacked her. "Look, bitch, I'm his wife. I love this man more than anyone else on the planet, including our son. I'm trying to help you help him get better. And what the hell is his heart rate?" I shouted. The policeman at the door opened it and looked into the room. When he saw that everything was fine, he closed it again. "His heart rate is 54 beats per minute, and that's normal," she began. I just smiled at her. "Why are you smiling?" she asked. "Because it's normal for him," I said. "He runs every day, so his heart rate is lower." "Thank you, ma'am," she said. "Can you tell me what happened to him?" I asked. "He was robbed, that's all I know," she said. "Judging by what we could see when he was brought in, he was given a very large dose of some kind of sleeping pill. It almost killed him. The police don't know if it was an accident or if they were trying to kill him, which is why there was a guard at his door. If they were trying to kill him, they might come back. She left, and I sat in the chair next to his bed, holding his hand. I don't know how long it took before I dozed off too. The next thing I heard was the sound of voices in the room. Awa, they look so cute together, a female voice said. I liked her right away. She must really love him. Appearances can be deceiving, my son said. I sat up and wiped the sleep from my eyes. Thank you, Mom, he said. I am your debtor. You can go back to what you were doing. He stood over me as if he expected me to move to take my place. Apparently, in his opinion, now that he was around, I was no longer needed. Rage overwhelmed me. I have let Mark down more than once. This will never happen again. I stood up, but only to get within reach. I hit my son. I brought you into this world, and I can still bring you out, I told him. You're not too old for me to kick your ass and send you to your room. The woman next to him smiled. I felt warmth throughout my body, and the discomfort in my stomach returned with a vengeance. Can you make the noise quieter? Mark said, waking up. My head is beating like a drum. Hello, son. Hi, Janet. Miriam, what are you doing here? I'm here because when someone you love gets into trouble, nothing can keep you away from them. Neither stupid nurses, nor rude policemen, nor even arrogant children will be able to keep you from him, I said. Or, to put it in simpler terms that even you can understand, I am here because I belong here. What happened to you, darling? I asked. Miriam, I told you that you should call me. He began. Shut up, I snapped. I can call you whatever I want. I smiled again. He looked at me strangely and then changed the subject. Deborah decided to cook me dinner at the apartment, he said. Is Deborah the one you're dating? I asked meaningfully. She's too young for you. You tried to have sex with her, didn't you? She almost killed you. Can I finish, or are you going to interrupt me? He asked. I smiled because that's how we always talk to each other. If I thought he would let me, I would immediately take his hand. I wanted this so bad. I was very warm and very weak, but I was so glad that he woke up. She brought a bunch of food to cook for me, he continued. We went on a few dates, and she came to my apartment a couple of times, but only for a few minutes each time. And let me guess, I said angrily. The light was never on, and she never walked past the couch. Miriam, he began. Are you even smart enough to use protection? I hissed. Tears were already streaming down my face, and I crossed my arms angrily. Miriam, what I do or have done is no longer your business, he said calmly. Besides, weren't you the one who told me to go find someone? But I didn't really want this, I sobbed. If you really need to look into my affairs, Miriam, he said, I never had sex with Deborah or any other women I dated. Were there others? I screamed. Miriam, it hurts, he said sadly. You have no idea what it's like to find out that the person you love most in the world doesn't love you back. I hit him almost as hard as I hit our son. Mark June's girlfriend covered her face to keep from laughing. You have no idea what it's like either, idiot, I shouted. Let's do this again. I screwed up. I screwed up royally. But I did what I did to protect the two people I love more than anything in the world. What I did was as wrong as leaving 3 shoes behind, but I never stopped loving any of you. You can call me stupid. You can refuse to talk to me, and you can rip my heart out by walking away from me, but you can never tell me that you both feel that I love you, can you? They looked at each other and nodded. And yes, Mark, I told you to go and find another woman. I even told you to have sex with her and maybe even marry her, but I lied. I turned and looked at my son. That's the same lie I told you to get you to eat your damn vegetables when you were 6, I said. Mark, I wanted you to go out there and meet some women because I wanted you to compare how you felt when you were with them to how you felt when you were around me. I wanted you to see it just felt wrong, and that you had no connection with them because you and I belong together, Mark. Is this the example you are trying to set for your son? Mark looked down and couldn't meet my gaze. You are an engineer. You have to solve problems and find ways to make things work. Earn your damn salary. At the same time, your son is waiting for answers and advice from you. Is this really the example you need? Do you want him to be like this? A man with a pig's head up his ass, pretending to want something he doesn't really want, when the simplest solution solves the problem best. Miri, he began, and I wanted to cry. I was so happy to hear him call me that. Oh, so I'm Miri again, I said, trying to hide the joy in my voice. I looked at Mark Jr. I never called you anything other than Mom, he said quickly, which made Janet laugh again. I liked her more and more. Can I continue? Mark asked. I realized I didn't have any wine or any drinks, so I told Deborah. He began. Deborah, 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 I hissed. How many times will you call the name of this woman of easy virtue? I told her that while she started cooking, He began again. Did you tell who? I asked. Deborah, he blurted out in irritation. You see, I said loudly, you said her name again. So I told the nameless prostitute I shouldn't have dated, that I'd go to the store to get some drinks while she started cooking, he continued with a disgruntled tone. He looked straight at me when he said this. You said it very well, dear, I replied with a smile. She asked me to help her get something off the shelf, he continued. I remember that I had the keys in my hands. Since I was about to go out, I needed them. As you know, I keep my house and car keys separate. I don't like extra weight on my car keys because, over time, it will wear out the ignition switch. Mark Jr. finished for him. Janet and I rolled our eyes, begging for help from above. And that saved me, Mark continued. I deliberately dropped my keys in the sink, made the house keys stay in the sink, and the car keys fell down the drain. A few minutes later, I heard this trash. Sorry, nameless woman of easy virtue, talking to someone on the phone. He must have been standing at the door because she went and let him in. I heard them talking. He looked at me and our eyes met. He told her that she didn't hit me hard enough because I was still conscious. He injected something into me. He asked where my car keys were, and she gave him the keys from the sink. He told her there were no car keys on the ring. She told me to forget about the car because it was too noticeable. Several more people entered the apartment, but I was already losing consciousness. The next thing I remember was waking up and seeing the doctors working on me. They gave me some kind of stimulant to counteract what was in the syringe that was injected by this friend of, well, a nameless woman of easy virtue. When I had time to briefly look around the apartment before falling back to sleep, I saw that they had stolen everything they could. All the furniture was stolen. All household appliances, paintings on the walls, carpets, everything was gone. I was lying on a bare wooden floor in an empty apartment. Oh my God, I said. Mark, when you said you dropped your keys, that meant you hid them and thus saved your car, right? He nodded and continued talking, even though I rolled my eyes again. When they left, the door was left open, and one of my neighbors saw me lying on the floor. He tried to wake me up, but couldn't, so he called 911. The paramedics found my contact card, so they called Mark Jr. I think you know the rest. When I find this piece of shit, her ass will be finished, I said. Then I looked at Mark again. Why am I not listed on your emergency card? Mark Jr. lives almost 2 hours away from us, even with how fast you two drive, or rather fly. Janet, always keep your insurance separate from his, I said with a smile. The police have a special stack of speeding tickets with Mark Jr.'s name and address on it, and his dad isn't much better. He just has a radar and a laser detector in his car, so he gets caught less often. Ha ha ha, we're not such bad drivers, Miri, Mark said. If I'm such a bad driver, why do you always let me drive you? I felt terrible. It was difficult for me to speak, but I was so glad that we were talking again that I tried to answer. Because if you ever kill yourself in this car, I will go with you, Mark, I said, slurring my tongue. We belong together. Love you. I felt something explode in my stomach, and I couldn't speak anymore. The last thing I heard was someone's voice shouting, "She's not feeling well." Mark. Mr. Dawson, you probably shouldn't get out of bed yourself, the doctor said. Lying in bed and worrying won't do you any good either, I replied. How soon will we know something? We already know what it is, he said. And once you sign these consents, she will go into surgery to fix everything. Operation? I asked in fear. Are you sure? He just nodded. Mark, I was her doctor for over 30 years. First, we checked for possible complications from the procedure she had after the birth of your son so that she could no longer have children. It was in the right area, but that wasn't the cause. Did she complain about stomach problems? She's been taking heartburn pills a lot lately, I said. That explains a lot, he said. We found several cancers in her colon. We think the stress you've both been through has put them in a dangerous state. What happened to you today probably caused several of them to rupture and create perforations in the intestinal wall. We need urgent surgery to repair the damage and remove as many remaining polyps as possible. This will be followed by several sessions of radiotherapy to destroy any remaining cancer cells. It will likely require 2 surgeries. I nodded and reached for the pen and form he handed me. While I was waiting outside the operating room door, various thoughts were spinning in my head. The operation seemed like an eternity, although it probably only lasted a few hours. Finally, one of the doctors came out and reported that they were able to repair the damage. Because of her age, doctors decided that Miriam should wait 10 days to 2 weeks before her next surgery. I thanked the doctors and went to the recovery room. I had to wait almost an hour before she was moved there, but I walked right behind her gurney and stayed by her side while she was transferred to the bed. Just as the nurse was about to tell me I couldn't stay, the same nurse Miriam had bumped into in my room recognized me and said something quietly to her colleague. She just sighed and shook her head, leaving me sitting holding Mary's hand. The nurse came over to check my vital signs several times while we waited for the anesthesia to wear off. You need to be in bed yourself, she said. Mary didn't wake up until the next morning. Are you still here? She asked. Perhaps now you will admit that you still love me. I just couldn't find any other place to go, I chuckled. That nameless woman of easy virtue apparently took everything out of your apartment, she answered with a grin. I've always loved nameless women of easy virtue, I said with a smile. Seriously, where did you sleep, honey? In this chair, I replied, and I can prove it with a terrible pain in the ass. I thought I was your biggest pain in the ass, she chuckled, but I'm glad you got some sleep. I didn't get much sleep, I said. Between the pain in my ass and your snoring, I could barely close my eyes. Holy God, they've already started, the nurse exclaimed, entering the room to check on Miri's condition and offer her breakfast. Of course, Miri replied. The nurse placed a glass of some liquid in front of her. What the hell is this? Miri asked, looking at the glass with disgust. This is your breakfast, the nurse replied. After bowel surgery, you will have to give up solid food for a while. For the next 3 days, I did not leave her bed. I made all the necessary arrangements so that Miri could return home. I even rented a special vehicle for transportation, since it was obvious that it would be too inconvenient for her to travel in my Mustang. When we got her home and put her to bed, she just looked at me with a big smile. Honey, can you make me some tea before you start moving your things back to our bedroom? She asked. I looked at her as if she had gone crazy. I'll stay until the nurse gets here, I said. Don't worry about it, she replied. He's already here. What do you mean he? I asked sharply. The nurse I hired was a woman. I don't want. Why does this bother you? She interrupted. If you don't want us to be together, you don't care what I do. Are you jealous? If you're worried about me having sex with him, don't worry. I'm not jealous, I lied. And besides, you're not in the right state for sex right now. My doctor said that if you are careful, everything will be fine. So yeah, if you can date nameless prostitutes who are 15 years younger than you, why can't I have sex with my honey brother if he wants? Do what you want, Miriam, I said sharply. Maybe he won't want to, she said sadly. He'd be crazy if he didn't, I replied. She smiled. Maybe he'll get fired, she said. I told him to make me some damn tea, and he just stands there. I spent the rest of the day tending to Miri, doing everything she asked. We talked a lot. I told her about my dates during the time we were apart. He told me how he constantly compared these women to her and how they always lost in this comparison. Deborah was the first person I let into my home and the only one I even kissed. Why do you constantly mention the name of this woman of easy virtue? She grinned. When Miri started to fall asleep, I went to the guest room to sleep. I woke up early in the morning to prepare her breakfast. While she was chewing oatmeal, she made all sorts of grimaces. "Mark, are you ready for our first argument of the day?" she asked, smiling. I took a piece of bacon and nodded. "I know you won't like it, but I'll say it anyway. I love you, Mark. But despite this, there is a reason we both did what we did during our marriage. I don't fix things, and you don't know how to cook. I know you tried, honey, and I love you even more for it. But this muffin tastes like sawdust. And why is your bacon different from mine? My bacon tastes like sawdust too. Is this some kind of punishment? Miri, I didn't make muffins. I bought them. This is bran, it helps maintain intestinal health. And your bacon is tofu. It's much less fatty than regular bacon. It's healthier for you, I explained. Then why don't you eat sawdust too? She asked. I can eat whatever I want because I run and exercise regularly, I chuckled. So finish your breakfast. We need you to get better for your next surgery. You look too happy at the thought of having things cut out for me again, she said. Do you think this is some kind of punishment? Miri, why do you always talk about punishment? I asked. I just think that when you do something bad, you are punished, you are forgiven, and you can move on, she said quietly. Miri, we've already been through this, I said. There was no need for punishment. You are a grown woman. We just went straight to the reconciliation stage. But it's wrong, she protested louder. Does your back hurt? My back is fine, I said, puzzled. I'm just worried that as you get older, your back might hurt if you bend over and put your head up your ass so much. You and I are meant to be together, and you know it, she said. Every nurse in the hospital told me how you walked out of your hospital room and never left my side. Nobody could move you. You didn't leave until I woke up. You sat on a hard wooden chair all night instead of leaving me alone. Miri began to cry again. Miri, I'm right here next to you, I said. But as soon as I get better, you'll leave, and we both know it, she blurted out. You think I don't know you? While I was unconscious, you held my hand and spoke to me. You said such sweet things, but all you said was something like, I'll be here until you get better, or I'll always be here if you call me. How about you say, I'll be there for as long as you want. Say it and mean it, she added. Mark, you are a good person, and the nurses were right, but you are also a cruel person. For all 25 years of our marriage and 2 years before it, I got used to the fact that you always touch me. You've always done this. It's just in your nature. Sorry, I said. You just loved me and loved to touch me, she replied, and I liked it too. It's like your car. At first I didn't understand why every time you walked past her, you ran your hand over her or stroked her. But then it dawned on me, this is your attitude towards the things you love. I smiled and nodded. But since you found out about George, you haven't touched me once. You held my hand in the hospital, but it was just to let me know that you are there, that you support me. But I feel that you no longer consider me yours. And every time I try to touch you, you flinch and move away. This really hurts, Mark. I'm so sorry, Miri, I said. Is it true? You don't have to be sorry, Mark, she replied. Be passionate. Another week passed before Miri returned to the hospital. She had a second surgery to remove the remaining polyps, which was successful. While she was in the hospital, she received targeted radiotherapy. Using a small probe, doctors target a specific area so that the radiation hits only the affected tissue, with minimal damage to healthy tissue. This was supposed to speed up her recovery. Apart from weakness and bouts of vomiting, Miri was promised a complete recovery. I arrived at the hospital again on the day she was supposed to be discharged. She felt fine the night before. One of the nurses who saw me couldn't see my eyes, and I immediately knew something was wrong. "Mr. Dawson, I have bad news for you," she said. "Everything happened very quickly." "What exactly happened quickly?" I asked, feeling fear overcome me. "Where is she?" "Come with me," she said. She took me to the hospital basement, and we entered the morgue. She pointed to the room where the nurse was working on the body. Even from the corridor, I recognized her immediately. It was Miri. I couldn't control myself and burst into tears. 3 months later, as it was getting dark, my son came to visit me. "Dad, why did you ask me to come?" Mark Jr. asked. "I want to show you something," I said. "You know I'm leaving on a cruise tomorrow morning." "Why did you need me to bring Janet?" he asked. "She really needs to study for her exams." "Shouldn't you be preparing yourself?" I asked. "Come on, it's in our blood, the second generation of engineers," he chuckled. For Mark Jr., this was a kind of defensive reaction to the fact that I was not his biological father. He didn't admit it. Now he simply called George, that strange old man who lived next door. Yes, I moved into our house again. Sometimes I felt lonely and longed for the times when Miri, George, and Cora and I were almost like family. My new neighbors were gay, and although they were very friendly, they kept to themselves. Remembering the fun times we had in the old days, I wished things would end differently. Now we were all scattered in different places. Cora went to Las Vegas, where she lived on George's money with her young lover. George was broke and barely making ends meet. Last I heard, he was fired from Walmart, where he worked as a greeter. They couldn't keep him at work because of his disgusting attitude. The man who wanted everything ended up with nothing. And Miri was up there somewhere, and I hoped she was looking at me because I wanted her to see what my son and I were doing. "Close your eyes, Mark," I said. "I hate surprises," he muttered. "I remember what the last surprise was here." "This surprise also has something to do with George," I said. He immediately became wary. "Dad, I don't want to see him. I don't want to talk to him. I—" He trailed off as I pressed the button, and the garage door began to rise. As soon as the garage opened, his eyes fell on a brand new 2012 Mustang GT. "Damn it," he exclaimed. "You bought yourself a new Mustang. Can I have your old car?" "No," I replied. "No way." "Well, you definitely needed a new car," he chuckled. "I'm tired of beating you at our races. When you get back from your cruise, we'll have to have a race. It's a really cool car, Dad, and you even chose red instead of the boring gray like your old one." "Our cars are the same color, stupid. Mine just has no stripes." "I hate red cars," I said. "They resemble fire engines or prostitutes' cars." "Then why did you buy it?" he asked. I opened the door on the other side of the garage. "I didn't buy it," I said. "This one is yours. Mine is standing next to it boring gray. I used George's money, so stop complaining. Now we have the same cars with the same power, and when I overtake you, there will be no excuses." After my son was absolutely delighted with his new car, and I received enough thanks, hugs, and promises from him to beat me at our future races, I went into the house. Mark and Janet left. He drove his new Mustang, and she drove his old one. I went upstairs, undressed in my bedroom, and went to bed. I closed my eyes, wondering if I would have time to go for a run before leaving for my cruise in the morning. In the darkness of the room, I suddenly felt something. "Miri," I said, "I thought you were sleeping." "Mark, do you love me?" she asked. I remembered that day 3 months ago when I looked at her body in the morgue through tears. I couldn't stop. I was crying. My heart was breaking. Life lost its meaning without her. I was like a ship lost in the ocean. Or, to be more precise, like a canoe on a river, but without oars. That's exactly how I felt. It's like my whole life was thrown overboard. Yes, I had a son, and I knew that Mark Jr. would always be there. But without Miriam, without her, all of this was empty, meaningless. All the years that we lived together flew before my eyes at that moment when I saw her lying on a cold metal table in the morgue. I knew that if I had to look into her dead eyes, I myself would not want to continue living. "Did you love her?" asked the blinking nurse. "With all my heart and soul," I replied, struggling to get the words out through my sobs. "What would you give to have her back?" she asked. "That's a stupid question," I snapped. "Just answer," she insisted. "I would give everything," I said. "I would give it at any price, even if I had to take her place." "That would be really stupid." Miriam's voice suddenly rang out, and I sat bolt upright in bed. She sat looking at me, her eyes shining with a living light. "If you had died, we still wouldn't be together, and I would be alone again. Then I would have to die again to be reunited with you. Perhaps I should be the one planning everything now." I hugged her, holding her as tightly as I could, afraid that she would disappear again. "Miri, you," I started, but she interrupted me gently. "You'll kill me if you squeeze like that," she grinned, and then leaned over and kissed me. I was so happy that she was with me again that I could not help but answer her. "You promised," she reminded. "You said you would give everything. All I need is a chance." It took time for everything to fall into place again. I returned to our house, but initially slept in the guest room. Miriam did not give up. She knew when to insist and when to retreat. She never gave up, and in the end, we were able to overcome it all. I can't say that some days I don't remember what she did, but at such moments, it is enough for me to remember that terrible day in the hospital when I thought that she had died, and immediately everything fell into place. Miriam saw it on the Jerry Springer Show or Maury, where they showed troubled teenagers being brought into the morgue and allowed to see their mother lying on the table, seemingly dead. This shocked the teenagers, and they began to behave correctly, and it worked for me too. It made me realize that despite what she had done, deep down she was acting out of a desire to protect me. One jealous man tried to get something he didn't deserve and paid for it, and Miriam paid for many years of guilt and a forced relationship with George. One of her confessions always stuck in my head. She said that George simply satisfied himself around her, without touching her. I asked why she used protection. She said she didn't want him to touch what she always thought was mine. I didn't want Miriam to suffer any more. I didn't want to punish her, and I didn't want to live the rest of my life alone with no way to move forward. How I sometimes wanted to give up everything, but I knew that without her, I would have no meaning in life, like a canoe stuck on a river without oars. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.